A few months ago, I found myself at an invitation-only tech summit. It was in one of those sleek, glass-walled conference centers overlooking the Potomac. The room was, filled with the usual architects of the Western consensus. You had venture capitalists in their quarter zips, policy advisors from all the prestigious alphabet soup agencies. And on the main stage, a keynote speaker was waxing poetic about strategic decoupling. He was painting this picture of a West that was finally growing a backbone, cutting ties with China to protect our innovative edge. And there was this palpable sense of triumph in the room, a feeling that by closing the gates, we were finally securing our lead. But during the coffee break, I noticed a senior patent attorney. He was just standing by the window, staring blankly at this printout from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. He wasn't celebrating. So I asked him what he thought of the speech. He didn't give me some political soundbite. He just tapped the finger on a graph. It was titled Humanoid Robotics Patents, 2025. He said, "For every one of these we file," and his voice dropped to this low, dry rasp, "they file 5. And that one statistic, 5 to 1, it just seemed to suck all the air out of the room's self-congratulatory atmosphere. While the speaker on stage was busy talking about values and financialized growth, the numbers on that paper, they told a story of a different civilization, one obsessed with the raw physical reality of engineering. The attorney looked at the room full of lobbyists and consultants, and he just sighed. He whispered, "We're building walls to protect a treasure chest that we haven't realized is nearly empty." And the immediate shift from that high-energy rhetoric of winning the trade war to the cold, clinical reality of technological displacement, it was just jarring. It made the whole idea of decoupling look less like some strategic maneuver and more like a desperate defensive crouch. The behavior of a late-stage empire trying to hide its industrial decay behind a curtain of policy papers. And it raised a question that the keynote speaker very carefully avoided. Is the West actually decoupling to stay ahead, or is it simply building its own casket? To find the answer, I think we have to look at the autopsy of a technological twilight.
That anecdote is incredibly powerful. It just cuts right through the political noise to the core issue, doesn't it?
It really does.
The cold statistic, that 5 to 1 patent ratio, specifically in a field like humanoid robotics, that's the real indicator. It suggests that while the West is focused on building walls, its competitor is focused on engineering the future.
So our mission for this deep dive is to look beyond just the trade wars and ask why that innovative edge seems to be eroding institutionally.
Right. We need to get at the root causes.
Okay, let's unpack that. We're moving beyond the symptoms, the trade deficits, the tech competition, to look at the systemic health of advanced democracies. The analysis we're looking at dives right into what it calls the democratic deficits, suggesting this malaise isn't just about bad policy or bad elections. It's rooted in these deep structural compromises.
It's a crucial distinction. For decades, especially after the Cold War, the West just asserted that democracy held these key systemic advantages.
Right, that it was just inherently better.
Exactly. It was supposed to provide superior participation, letting diverse voices be heard, superior deliberation, leading to better laws, superior social solidarity, binding everyone together, and critically, superior capacity, the ability to actually get the job done efficiently and effectively.
And the argument now is that all 4 of these are being compromised at the same time.
All 4. Consolidated democracies are facing challenges that are hitting all 4 of those theoretical advantages simultaneously.
And these aren't just abstract worries. This breakdown is showing up in our ability to govern. Let's focus first on the decline in participation and deliberation, especially with political parties and legislatures. The analysis points to this accelerated decline of political parties as effective institutions. What does that decline actually look like on the ground?
It's a structural dissolution, a breakdown of discipline and coordination. If you think back to the mid-20th century, political parties provided these vital organizational resources.
They coordinated platforms, they selected candidates.
Right, through robust, sometimes messy local organizations. They disseminated information, and in exchange for all that, they demanded party loyalty and discipline from their elected representatives because they controlled access to patronage and power.
And
now what we see globally is the dissolution of that control. It's been replaced by a kind of free agency style of politics. It's all centered on individual personalities or momentary, highly emotional issues. The organizational fabric that once held together these broad, diverse political coalitions is it's coming undone.
Which is what's being labeled political fragmentation. I like that term. It sounds like something physically breaking apart.
That's exactly what it is. And it works on two levels. There's external diffusion.
Meaning power moving away from the parties themselves.
Yes, away from the parties as cohesive organizations and flowing toward interest groups, single-issue nonprofits, independent and political action committees. Then you have internal diffusion. And that's power moving away from the established party leadership, the speaker, the majority leader, and toward individual members and, specific, often more radical internal factions.
So that centralized efficiency that used to define the party is just gone. I remember reading that economists use the term fissuring for when big companies start outsourcing their supply chains and things like that. Is this related?
Precisely. It's the same principle. If you use simple economics, parties were historically these large horizontal organizations. Their main advantages were access and scale. They brought all the components of political action under one roof. They made everything they needed.
But now it's cheaper to buy it.
Exactly. Thanks to technology, globalization, the ease of communication, the transaction costs of finding resources outside the party have just plummeted. It's less administratively burdensome to buy rather than make political functions. A candidate can now raise money, talk directly to their base on social media, hire specialized consultants. They don't need the traditional party machine. And that leads to this specialized, atomized politics where nobody feels accountable to the central organization anymore.
Which leads directly to the core of the democratic deficit. The paralysis of legislative branches. If parties can't coordinate their own members, how can Congress or Parliament possibly legislate effectively?
Well, the data is a pretty stark confirmation of that legislative paralysis, particularly in the U.S. context. We've seen a massive, measurable decline in legislative output.
How bad is it?
If you look at the 1970s, the U.S. Congress, despite all its deep political divisions at the time, enacted as many as 804 bills annually.
Okay, 804.
That number, the raw output of laws that define the function of government, has plummeted. In a recently finished Congress, that figured down to only 329 bills.
Wait, from over 800 down to 329? That's a collapse in their ability to do their job.
It's a collapse in collective action capacity. It's nearly a 60% drop. And this is the environment where vetocracy thrives.
Vetocracy, let's define that. It's where special interests can just veto everything, right?
That's a good way to put it. It's a political situation where special interests or increasingly powerful internal minority factions can effectively veto any measure that's harmful to them. The system is optimized for blocking, not for building.
So it's easier to stop things than to start them.
Much easier. When collective action for the common good requires this intricate coordination, and the system allows for all these single points of failure, the default result is just poor governance.
The example in the material, the struggle to repeal the Affordable Care Act, seems like a perfect illustration.
It's a pure demonstration of vetocracy in action. I mean, regardless of your view on the policy itself, here you had a party that campaigned for 7 years on repealing it.
They held the House and the Senate.
And still struggled immensely just to pass legislation they all supposedly agreed on. The ideological factions empowered by this fragmentation could hold the entire process hostage. They had the power to stop something, but not the capacity to coalesce around an alternative and actually govern.
So if the legislative branch, the core engine of democracy, is paralyzed, nature abhors a vacuum, where does that governing power go?
It flows naturally to the executive branch. It has to, which is why we've seen the concurrent rise in executive unilateralism. Policy is increasingly set not through new laws passed by Congress, but through executive orders, regulatory changes, administrative law.
And there's data on that too, right?
Absolutely. Look at the historical marker of a president's muscle. The number of substantive legislative initiatives passed in their first 100 days. Franklin Delano Roosevelt initiated 76 new statutes in his first 100 days. Modern presidents, even with a unified government, see drastically smaller numbers.
Like what?
George W. Bush had 7. Barack Obama had 14. More recently, we've seen administrations with virtually 0 substantive legislative initiatives in that traditional period of maximum influence.
So the energy hasn't changed, but the form of governance has shifted fundamentally away from the legislature. And this, crucially, messes with democratic accountability, doesn't it?
Completely. When Congress is silent, when it fails to act, the power vacuum pulls the courts into a central checking role. But judicial restraint is inherently easier when Congress has already provided a clear path, a statute to interpret.
But if there's no statute,
if the legislature is paralyzed, if it's silent on critical issues, the executive's power is at a higher doctrinal ebb. It makes judicial repudiation of executive actions significantly more difficult. The checks and balances are compromised simply because one of the major branches has structurally failed to do its job.
This inability to coordinate and get the job done brings us to the most visceral metric of this decline in state competence.
Yeah.
Infrastructure. This is where the contrast between these high-capacity, objective-driven states in East Asia and the fragmented governance of the West becomes almost embarrassing.
Infrastructure provides a tangible, objective measure of execution capacity. The difference in timeline, cost, and scope. It's profoundly illuminating, and it directly relates to who can win the technological race.
How so?
Well, if you can't build a subway line efficiently, how can you possibly execute a 30-year quantum computing roadmap?
Fair point. Let's look at the Chinese example of high-capacity execution.
Let's take Beijing's Terminal 3 international arrivals. This is a monumental structure designed by the celebrated English architect Norman Foster. It's not just functional, it's aesthetically stunning. It's designed to be a symbol of a rising power.
And the speed of construction was the key thing.
The speed is what's remarkable. It was constructed from design approval to completion in just 4 years. 4. This required a level of relentless coordination. They utilized 3 work crews per day, working rotating 8-hour shifts, 24/7. Foster himself said this was driven by a very, very clear idea of objectives and getting on with it. It demonstrates a state capacity focused purely on rapid, large-scale, high-quality public endeavors.
And then we contrast that with a Western example.
The contrast is painful. Let's take Heathrow's Terminal 5 in London. Also designed by Norman Foster. It took 20 years to complete.
20 years.
2 decades of bureaucracy, delays, reviews, political infighting, and when it finally opened, it was described charitably as merely functional. It achieved none of the grandeur or symbolic weight of its Beijing counterpart.
And this isn't a knock on the engineers.
Not at all. It's a demonstration of the inherent difficulties of a democratic society's process when coordination fails. The narrative often becomes, oh, well, it took a long time, but that's the price of a democratic society's rigorous review process. But that rigorous process often just means structural incapacity.
The U.S. experience seems to take this structural incapacity to an almost absurdist extreme, not just in delay, but in shocking, extravagant cost. The Second Avenue subway extension in New York is the perfect example.
It is the ultimate illustration of vetocracy's price tag. The line finally opened in 2017, 88 years after it was first proposed.
88 years.
The delay alone is staggering, but the costs are what truly impede the governance process.
How do the coordination issues in a dense city like that translate into such an astronomical cost?
Well, digging a subway under Manhattan requires meticulous, back-breaking coordination. You have to navigate hundreds of miles of existing gas, water, electric, and telecom utilities, and you have to coordinate with a dozen separate regulatory, municipal, and private agencies. It's a nightmare.
The builders found this task, the task of bureaucratic and political coordination, so daunting, so impossible to manage, that they literally chose the path of maximum engineering difficulty instead.
They made a strategic decision to avoid the politics, even if it meant monumental expense.
Exactly. The decision was made to dig the tunnels extremely deep into the hard Manhattan bedrock. This allowed them to avoid contact with the labyrinth of existing utility lines and, crucially, avoid having to coordinate with all the various utility companies and regulators entirely. The engineers chose to overcome geology rather than overcome governance.
I found that absolutely fascinating. That the engineering solution blasting tunnels deep into solid rock was deemed simpler and cheaper than managing the transaction costs of modern democratic coordination.
That single decision tells you everything you need to know about the state of Western governance. And the quantifiable result of avoiding that administrative difficulty was an extravagant cost of almost $2 billion per kilometer.
Billion per kilometer.
For a tiny 3-kilometer extension with just 4 stops. That is the measurable price tag of administrative and political dysfunction.
So we've established the systemic disrepair. Fragmentation leads to vetocracy, which leads to legislative paralysis, which leads to exorbitant costs and an inability to execute major projects. But to understand why the paralysis is so profound, we need to dive deeper into why the foundational glue of democratic societies, the political party, has hollowed out so completely.
It's absolutely foundational. I mean, if you agree with the historians who say that political parties created modern democracy, then the decay of that structure is the most insidious form of decline. The question becomes, what caused this fissuring of power?
Let's look first at the institutional support structure that has collapsed. The analysis points to a sharp decline in organizational support across the board for both labor and capital.
On the labor side, the decline of union power is well documented. Union density is at historical lows. While overall union membership is around 11% of the American workforce, the private sector figure is below 7%.
And the composition has changed too, right?
That's the real institutional problem. Unions increasingly represent public employees. This means they're no longer an independent external source of participatory engagement, coordinating the labor movement outside the state.
They stop being an independent voice of the working class and instead become part of the state apparatus.
Precisely. They become largely an expression of the political party they're affiliated with, often focused on issues specific to state and city budgets rather than broad economic policy. The organizational strength that used to demand discipline from political leaders, creating a counterweight, it's just gone.
And this is mirrored on the capital side, with organizations like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce.
The Chamber of Commerce used to represent a broad, diffuse set of local and regional businesses. It has transformed into the exponent of highly concentrated capital interests. Their agenda has become incredibly focused and narrow. It's prioritizing legacy industries, fossil fuels, banking, tobacco, and crucially, the funding base shows astonishing centralization.
How centralized?
According to the analyses, a tiny pool of just 64 top donors were responsible for more than 50% of all donations to the chamber. 94% of total funding came from just 1,500 top donors.
So whether it's labor or capital, the broad mediating institutions that were designed to coordinate and moderate diverse interests have just vanished.
They've been replaced by narrow sectional interests that are already highly concentrated and entrenched. The parties are hollowed out, lacking a grassroots constituency that's independently organized.
And this hollowed-out structure leads directly to the counterproductive effects of what the sources call democratic romanticism.
This is that unique cultural tendency, especially in the U.S., to idealize individualized participation and harbor a deep, reflexive distrust of intermediate institutions like parties.
This distrust shows up in reform attempts, particularly the allure of direct democracy. The idea that if the elites and parties are failing, we should just ask the people directly.
That's the romantic impulse. Let's bypass the messy, seemingly corrupt mediating institutions. But these referenda, these plebiscites, they often fail spectacularly to restore governing authority.
Like Brexit.
Exactly. Look at the Brexit referendum or the Italian constitutional referendum in 2016. These outcomes didn't settle the governance crisis. They simply confirmed the weakness of parliaments as authoritative institutions. When a majority of the voting population defies its own elected parliament, its political parties, and virtually every economic authority in the country, that confirms a crisis of political elite authority. It doesn't produce a solution. It produces chaos, not capacity.
And the critique argues that these reform attempts, even with noble intentions, often introduce new dysfunctions. The central example here is campaign finance reform, which was supposed to empower the individual citizen donor.
The intent was certainly to reduce the influence of organized money and empower the average voter, but the results have been the paradoxical opposite. These reforms have often made the system more polarized and less governable.
Wait, how does that work? How can campaign finance reform, aimed at citizen participation, actually increase polarization? We need to understand that mechanism.
The core finding is that political engagement is not uniform. The individuals motivated and organized enough to donate money, whether they are small dollar donors or large wealthy donors, are statistically more ideologically extreme than non-donors.
So the people who donate are on the fringes?
Disproportionately, yes. They are clustered on the far left or the far right. They are the purists. So when you empower the individual donor relative to the party organization, you are disproportionately empowering the extremes of the political spectrum.
And the historic efforts to curb big money inadvertently starved the very structure, the party that could have moderated that money.
That's the crucial point. The elimination of soft money contributions to the national parties in the early 2000s was meant to clean up politics. But soft money contributions were fully disclosed and channeled through a centralized structure.
So what happened when that was cut off?
The money didn't disappear. It just flowed outside the parties to independent groups like super PACs, which often focus on narrow, single-issue, and sectarian causes. These groups have zero incentive to compromise or broaden their appeal.
So a reform designed to purify politics actually disempowered the coordinating, moderating body, the party, and funneled massive funds into these highly atomized, single-issue ideological weapons that are inherently more radical and uncompromising.
That is the exact unintended consequence. Furthermore, when contributions are pooled centrally within a party, they tend to empower centrist candidates. They dilute the influence of any single large donor. The party, ironically, functions as a mechanism for moderation and compromise.
Because its success depends on winning elections across diverse districts, not just pleasing a small ideologically pure base.
Exactly. Limiting the party's ability to coordinate finances just strengthen the hands of the most uncompromising elements on both sides.
The net result of all this is the hyperpolarized political system we live in, which feeds directly into the legislative gridlock we talked about earlier.
It's a direct link. Hyperpolarized parties are, in a sense, excellent for voter accountability. They present sharply defined, differentiated brands. Voters know what they are getting.
Sure, the choices are clear.
The correlation between a voter's ideology and their chosen candidate is stronger than it has been in decades. Polarization increases turnout too.
But the governing cost is overwhelming. The gridlock and paralysis mean the state can't respond to strategic threats or execute long-term plans.
The gridlock is profound. But here's the counterintuitive part of the analysis. Many observers claim the problem is that the parties have become too disciplined, too parliamentary-like in their rigid loyalty. The sources suggest that the opposite is true.
The opposite.
The parties are not parliamentary-like enough.
Meaning that party leaders, the Speaker of the House, the Senate Majority Leader, they lack the institutional power to control and discipline their own more radical, recalcitrant members.
Exactly. When you look at government shutdowns, near financial defaults, or failure to pass basic spending bills, these events aren't just products of ideological polarization. They reflect the inability of party leaders to compel a minority faction or specific individual members to make necessary pragmatic deals. Power has diffused away from the center of institutional responsibility.
So if we are looking for the source of compromise, we have to look towards strengthening the very people who appear to lead these hyperpolarized parties. That sounds like a long shot.
It is paradoxical, but party leaders are identified as the most likely source of political compromise and pragmatism. There are critical structural reasons for this. First, negotiations are mathematically easier. It's simpler to coordinate among 3 to 5 leadership figures than with dozens of fragmented competing factions. Second, they're repeat players who build long-term trust. But most importantly, they're ideological middlemen within their own parties.
Because their institutional success depends on appealing to a broad constituency, the entire nation, or at least a majority of their legislative body, not just a single district.
Precisely. An individual member in a safe, ideologically purified district can afford to posture for the extreme base. The party leader, however, bears the ultimate responsibility if the institution fails. If the government shuts down or a major crisis isn't averted, the leader gets the blame. That responsibility creates a much stronger incentive for pragmatism and compromise.
It's a clear line then. The institutional decay of political parties leads to these high political transaction costs, which show up as the inability to build things efficiently. The $2 billion per kilometer subway. Then we have to transition to the second half of the problem, this divergence in civilizational vitality, how these states cultivate and mobilize their most important resource elite talent.
This is the ultimate indicator of the technological twilight we started with. The capacity to compete on fields like AI, quantum computing, and humanoid robotics depends entirely on the capacity to generate and mobilize high-end engineering and scientific talent. If the West's governing structure is decaying, how does its engine of human capital, its education system, stack up against its primary competitor, especially when that competitor is doubling down on meritocracy?
Let's start with the East Asian focus, specifically China, and their emphasis on systemic, objective meritocracy in higher education.
The Chinese approach is engineered for pure merit mobilization on a massive scale. Entry into their prestigious universities is intended to depend only on the result of the Gaokao entrance examination.
So it's all about one test.
It's a deliberate, systemic choice to prevent external factors common in the West, things like sporting achievements, extracurriculars, family alumni status, or financial donations from influencing who gets into the elite academic pipeline.
So the system, while incredibly high pressure, is explicitly designed to be a pure meritocratic filter, a social equalizer.
That is the stated emphasis of the education authorities, to ensure that talent mobilization is based purely on academic results, regardless of background. And this ensures a constant supply of highly tested, intellectually rigorous talent.
And the scale is immense.
The sheer scale is staggering. As of 2025, the system comprises over 3,100 higher education institutions enrolling nearly 50 million students. This provides a deep, vast pool of talent for national strategic sectors.
And the results are visible globally. It's translating directly into high-level recognition and innovation output.
The recognition is undeniable. China tops the QS Asia University rankings list, with 146 universities included and 7 institutions in the Asia top 10. That's a density unmatched by any other country in the region. Furthermore, recent reports show China topping the list for the academic ranking of world universities and the U.S. News & World Report Best Global Universities ranking. They are systematically and successfully building universities that are on par with or exceeding historically dominant institutions in the U.S. and the U.K.
Which brings us full circle back to the 5-to-1 patent ratio.
It's the inevitable translation of systemic academic rigor into national technological capacity. In terms of innovation output, 5 Chinese universities appeared in the global top 10 for the number of international patent applications filed via the World Intellectual Property Organization in 2020. This indicates a highly efficient, targeted system that is systematically feeding the most strategically important technological sectors with a constant stream of highly educated, tested engineering and scientific talent.
Now we have to pivot and contrast this relentless focus on pure systemic meritocracy with the ideological shifts occurring in Western higher education. This is where the sources identify a systematic subversion of merit.
The contrast is dramatic, and it often begins at the very top of Western societies. The sources point out a striking lack of relevant education or political experience requirements for top national leadership positions like president or prime minister. These positions, which hold the destiny of the entire state, have less stringent merit requirements than far less important roles, like a lawyer, a certified engineer, or a tenured professor.
So we demand professional qualifications for the civil servants, but allow a pure popularity contest, driven by emotion and personality, for the ultimate decision makers.
And this problem is exacerbated by the documented reality of tribalism in modern politics. Studies in political psychology show that voters, even highly informed ones, often vote primarily based on social identities and partisan loyalties, their tribe, not on pure policy analysis or competence.
People follow their party's lead.
Exactly. They'll follow their party's policy preferences even when those preferences shift dramatically. This means voters are susceptible to supporting incompetent demagogues if they belong to their political in-group. And since we can't reliably rely on voter competence alone to select the best leaders, focusing on the merit of candidates and cultivating meritocratic systems becomes an even more important structural defense.
And this is the foundation for the critique that diversity, equity, and inclusion DEI initiatives are fundamentally anti-meritocratic, eroding the academic rigor of Western institutions.
The critique originates from analyzing the ideological foundations of DEI, which are rooted in what's called critical social justice, or CSJ. CSJ itself draws heavily from a particular strain of Marxist critical theory. It frames all Western societal interaction through a highly simplified binary of oppressor versus oppressed, prioritizing collective identity, racial, gender, and so on over individual agency and objective merit. The challenge here is that the very definition of excellence is being ideologically redefined.
How does this ideology manifest in practice, particularly with the concept of critical thinking itself?
Well, CSJ is criticized for operating by starting with the conclusion and working backward, which is the reverse of classical critical thinking. For example, a core tenet suggests that when investigating an organizational problem, the question is not, did racism or discrimination take place, but rather, how did racism or discrimination manifest in this specific situation?
So the conclusion is assumed from the start.
The conclusion that oppression is definitely happening is assumed as a prerequisite, and the training is designed only to notice its manifestations. This ideological framework, the critique asserts, compromises the ability to objectively evaluate evidence and reach unbiased conclusions.
And this assumed framework then systematically subverts traditional meritocratic processes within the institutions themselves.
Exactly. In admissions, hiring, and faculty review, objective qualifications often take a backseat to perceived allyship with DEI principles or demographic representation targets. Universities are accused of redefining excellence as political compliance, prioritizing ideological conformity over objective qualifications. This naturally leads to a palpable chilling effect on intellectual dissent among both students and faculty.
The sources contain some specific and frankly startling examples of how this ideological shift plays out even in seemingly neutral areas.
The concept of ethnomathematics, which has emerged from higher education and teacher training programs, is a prime example cited by critics. This pedagogy argues that certain expected aspects of traditional math teaching, such as expecting students to show their work or demanding they get the right answer, are tools of racism derived from whiteness.
So the idea is that asking for the right answer in a math problem is a tool of whiteness. Is that the argument being made?
That's the argument being made. The goal is ostensibly to disempower hegemony and create more inclusive learning environments. But critics argue that by devaluing objective correctness and rigorous logical processes, the system is actively detrimental to the intellectual development and resilience of all students, regardless of their background.
So not only is the process for selecting elite talent being changed, but the actual training methods for developing core skills are being compromised. What's the overall effect on students?
The critique is harsh here. It suggests that DEI initiatives risk infantilizing students by persistently portraying them as perpetual victims of systemic injustice, rather than encouraging individual agency. This undermines resilience, which is crucial for innovation and problem solving. Critics argue that time and resources spent on ideological re-education and compliance are time not spent on developing core skills in reasoning, writing, engineering, or science. This avoidance of intellectual discomfort is seen as harmful to psychological development.
And this entire ecosystem has become a self-perpetuating, financially lucrative administrative industry.
It's a powerful fiscal critique. The DEI framework has evolved into a lucrative industry funded by skyrocketing student tuition, federal grants, and taxpayer dollars. It supports multi-million-dollar diversity consultancies and massively expanding administrative offices. The critique suggests institutions use moral cover to obscure significant fiscal irresponsibility and the redirection of resources away from teaching and research. The system is designed for self-perpetuation. The more institutional racism is perceived or discovered, the more DEI staff and training must be hired.
So the punchline of this critique is that at the exact moment, a global competitor is doubling down on elite, objective meritocracy to fuel their strategic technological advancement. Advanced democracies are systematically undermining meritocracy in favor of internal ideological conformance, thus shrinking the necessary talent pool.
That's the institutional divergence. The two civilization blocks are choosing radically different paths for how they select, train, and deploy their intellectual elites. One is prioritizing relentless, tested excellence and national strategic goals. The other is grappling with internal ideological shifts, which results in a divergence of intellectual and technological vitality.
We've established the institutional decay and the resulting intellectual divergence. Now, let's bring this back to the social contract. This systemic rot is happening against a backdrop of declining social cohesion in the West, which provides the volatile fuel for the populist politics that often feeds fragmentation and vetocracy.
The democratic sense of solidarity is profoundly under siege. It's from the combination of two major forces: rapid demographic change and widespread economic displacement. The level of foreign-born Americans is now at its highest point in a century, leading to rapid demographic shifts that challenge traditional social expectations. At the same time, large segments of the population have experienced profound economic stagnation.
We're talking about the traditional backbone of the industrial democratic electorate, the working and lower middle classes.
Specifically, the analysis focuses on the groups found at roughly the 65th to 85th percentiles of world income distribution. This group, which represents the working and lower middle classes of advanced industrial countries, they experience significantly lower rates of income growth, stagnation, or in some cases outright decrease between 1988 and 2008.
This is the elephant graph phenomenon.
Exactly. While the global poor and the global ultra-rich saw massive increases in wealth, this core democratic constituency was left behind.
So they find themselves simultaneously challenged by rapidly changing demographics, leading to a lost sense of cultural recognition and subjected to relentless downward economic pressure from globalization.
This combination creates the perfect storm that fuels the populist backlash. These groups feel profoundly under siege and disengaged from traditional political institutions that they believe have categorically failed to protect their social status and their wealth. Historically, the great political parties of the 20th century were tasked with protecting the vulnerable working class from economic dislocation. That capacity has eroded, leaving this constituency feeling abandoned.
And we have to identify the definitive event that delivered the final fatal blow to confidence in the traditional political status quo.
The 2008 financial crisis was that definitive blow. It stressed already weak political institutions to the breaking point. It fundamentally destroyed the faith of the laboring classes that the traditional political and economic system could cushion them from further devastating economic decline. When the institutions failed to hold the powerful accountable and failed to protect the working class from systemic collapse, the field was left wide open to populist anger, which seeks simple, non-institutionalized answers to complex problems.
So, to synthesize what we've uncovered in this autopsy, we have structural decay across every major institutional layer of advanced democracies.
That's the final picture. The political institutions are hollowed out by fragmentation. This leads to a vetocracy that favors blocking over building, often resulting in projects that cost billions per kilometer due to administrative incapacity. This institutional failure means democratic states cannot execute the large-scale, long-term public endeavors necessary to maintain strategic technological parity.
And this institutional incapacity is fatally compounded by a fundamental divergence in civilizational approaches to human capital. On one side, we see East Asian nations relentlessly doubling down on systemic, objective meritocracy as a powerful engine for strategic innovation output.
While on the other side, Western higher education struggles with internal, anti-meritocratic ideological shifts, eroding the institutional integrity necessary to maintain a competitive technological edge and effectively shrinking the talent pool. The technological twilight identified at the outset, the cold reality of the 5-to-1 patent ratio in advanced fields, is not merely an economic or military conflict. It is fundamentally an institutional and civilizational crisis. The structure of governance and the values embedded in that structure ultimately determine the capacity to produce, innovate, and lead on a global scale. The treasure chest, as the patent attorney observed, is indeed growing empty.